walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 97. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
Let me apologize in advance for leading off with a little self-promotion over these next few episodes. It's a necessary evil, but it's also kind of fun to get to crow about something you believe in. And as it happens, I have a new book coming out on July 11th. This podcast is being recorded on July 1st, 2025. And I think that new book's pretty good. It's called The Camino Compendium, a historical and cultural exploration of the Camino de Santiago. And I think it fills a niche that somehow still exists, despite the many books written about the Camino Frances. If you've listened for a while, you know that I'm a high school teacher who has led student groups on pilgrimage for years. As part of that experience, we ended most days with a group meeting. Sometimes we'd just have a discussion about what we were seeing and going through. But on other days, I would have a talk prepared on some interesting topic, or at least I thought it was, related to the places we were passing through. Formal guidebooks and David Gitlitz and Linda Davidson's The Pilgrimage Road to Santiago were essential resources, of course, when I was preparing for those student trips, trying to equip myself with enough foundational information to be able to guide the groups effectively on the Camino Frances. The only limitation of those sources, and this is not a criticism, just a reality, is that they tend to be more granular, discussing individual places and sites in isolation. And of course, because they had 800 plus kilometers to cover and tons of important sites to discuss along the way, brevity was essential. What can be lost in that approach is a cohesive narrative, a story that contextualizes those details, that helps the reader or listener make sense of the larger meaning. We learn through story, after all. So that's what I've tried to do in the Camino Compendium. There are 32 chapters, one for each loose stage of the Camino Frances, acknowledging, as always, that everyone walks the Camino in their own way, and those stages are merely organizational tools. In each case, there's one central story spotlighted. Some of those will be entirely new to a reader. Others are commonly referenced, like the Song of Roland in Stage 1, or the Dancing Roosters of Santo Domingo in Stage 9. Even in those more familiar cases, though, I have the room that guidebooks lack to get into much greater detail, digging through a range of academic materials that explore, for example, the evolution of the legend of the hanged innocent over the centuries. I promise you, you're going to learn a lot from this book, and you will see some very familiar sites in an entirely new light. The book is written with the pilgrim on the Camino top of mind. Each chapter is just long enough to be read over a café con leche during a long break, or when lounging in bed post-walk, but not so long that you're doomed to keel over unconscious halfway through. It's intended as the book that complements your guidebook. And of course, it's totally fine to read it at home as well. You can find a preview chapter on davewhitson.com, others on my Facebook page, and another still back in episode 94. And if you really want to dive in, 16 draft chapters are available right now on my Patreon. But the publication date isn't too far away. You can find the ebook, and again, it's the Camino Compendium, a historical and cultural exploration of the Camino de Santiago, available for pre-order on Amazon right this moment. The print copy will magically show up on July 11th as well. No pre-orders possible on that, unfortunately. And in the weeks that follow, it will work its way out to other bookstores and distributors. So please give it a look. Okay, self-promotion is over. Let's get to a different book and a different author. Dr. Kathryn Hurlock has a new book out called Holy Places: How Pilgrimage Changed the World, released just a few months ago. And I powered through it over the last week. In it, she shares case studies on 19 different pilgrimage sites around the world. Some, of course, are familiar, like Santiago, Rome, and Jerusalem. Others, though, receive far less attention. Have you ever read about Muxima, Angola, for example, or Ratana Pa, New Zealand, or Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer, France. I was most excited to talk with Kathryn about the subtitle of her book, though, How Pilgrimage Changed the World. As I mentioned to her in the conversation that follows, it's way more common to read books focused on how pilgrimage changed me. And fair enough, right? Like, that's an important angle, one that hits closer to home for many of us. But still, pilgrimage has been this powerful force across place and time. And for all the time many of us spend thinking about pilgrimage, this is something we could better understand. And that's where Kathryn's book comes in, along with the discussion that follows. I hope you enjoy. Dr. Kathryn Hurlock is a religious historian and the head of the History Research Center and reader in medieval history at Manchester Metropolitan University. She's the author of Holy Places, How Pilgrimage Changed the World, and Medieval Welsh Pilgrimage, among other things. So, Kathryn, what first inspired you to write this broad survey of important pilgrimage sites?
My main motivation is that I find people tend to have quite a fixed idea of what pilgrimage is. They have this really definite image in their heads of a walking pilgrim, quite often solitary, going to a particular kind of shrine and doing particular kind of things. But of course, pilgrimage is a universal practice. Pretty much all religions around the globe engage in pilgrimage in some form or another. And it transcends different faiths, different political backgrounds, different genders, different kinds of ability. And it stretches back for thousands of years. So one thing I wanted firstly was to do a book that was accessible to all, because as an academic, quite a lot of the stuff I write, very few people are going to honestly read, that covered some of that. But then I also wanted to cover lots of the different themes that are widely discussed in pilgrimage studies by academics, but don't seem to really be something that is more mainstream. So the fact that pilgrimages are incredibly political, that they can be very commercial, that they don't have to be this particular image of, a solitary walker or doing it for sort of spiritual reasons, that a lot of pilgrimage is about war and politics and identity and cohesion as much as it's about health and spirituality and healing. So it's an incredibly complex phenomenon, and I've tried, I hope, to get some aspect of that across by looking at 19 different places.
And I think you have, and we're going to talk about a lot of those things. So yeah, the dirtier, tawdrier aspects of pilgrimage, maybe some would say, as opposed to the more uplifting, enlightening ones.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned that you focus on 19 shrines, sanctuaries, pilgrimage sites. How did you arrive at that number? How did you go through that selection process?
Yeah, well, if I start off by saying 20 just felt too round. So I didn't want 20, but then I was trying to choose different places from around the globe. So I managed to include Africa and New Zealand and America and Central America, as well as all the sort of older ones you'd think about in places like India or Europe. And then I thought, well, I wanted to cover a range of faiths. I couldn't cover them all because that would be, twice the length, and a range of types. So, for example, many of the most important pilgrimage sites, certainly in Christianity and in the Western European experience, are Marian shrines, places like Fatima, for example. But I already had Lourdes in there, that's a Marian shrine, and Angola, that's a Marian shrine. So I couldn't do them all. So I had to pick which ones would let me tell particular stories. So I could have swapped out Lourdes and I could have gone for Fatima. And then I could have talked about war in the context of Fatima and the way that the visions that appear in 1917 are very much about, well, the revelations are about warning the children who see them about possibly things like warfare and what's going to happen in the 20th century. But then I couldn't have done the healing, so I would have had to have picked another site for the healing. So yeah, I had to choose to try and get overlap of themes, but also let me talk about some distinct areas. Harder than it sounds.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's a puzzle where all of the pieces have to fit together just so.
Yes, I mean, I easily could have done 50 sites. Yeah, where does it end?
The publisher might have had an issue with that.
Yeah, yeah, £100 hardback. I don't think so.
We'll get into those dirtier, tawdrier issues in a moment. But I was curious, just as I was going back through my annotations of your book this morning, how you would answer this impossibly broad question. What makes a place sacred? And the reason I wanted to ask that is because so many of the places you write about, the most sacred parts were destroyed over the years, right? So there's a ton of very important buildings and statues and relics that were shattered, and yet the place remains a pilgrimage site. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what makes a site sacred?
I suppose the broad answer, and you get this a lot in relation to Iona, which I cover in one chapter, is an idea that certain places in the world, they are sort of thin places where there's a connection between this world and the next, or the secular world and the spiritual. So yes, human beings, they build shrines, they build churches, they create things that you can interact with, and they might place relics or bodies of saints, things like that, at these locations. But ultimately, it's the place itself that also has this sort of spiritual power of some kind. So even when those things are removed, because it's a site where sanctity has been and where people have been to pray and to engage with the spiritual, that it still has that sort of quality. It's like it seeps into the landscape. So you get places like Iona, where St. Columba's body is gone, anywhere really, well, most places in Britain because of the Reformation, and they're still considered sacred because they did have something sacred there once. So it doesn't necessarily matter. And again, for some faiths, this is about contact. So as long as there's been a religious object or burial there, then the site itself is still holy, the earth itself is still holy. What I find interesting are the places where you've got a natural thing. So you've got the mountain of Taishan, lots of the mountains in China are considered holy in some way, or the river Ganges itself, which is, of course, continually moving, and yet is the embodiment of a goddess. So how does that work? And what happens when you pollute it? So what makes it spiritual in the first place is a connection to something sacred. What keeps it spiritual, I suppose, is people continually visiting it and wanting to read it in that way. And when they stop reading it in that way, as they do at Delphi, when Christianity takes over, and the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece is no longer important, people don't for that reason anymore. It's completely lost that meaning. So yes, people have to find that sanctity originally and then want it to stay. It's for a spiritual thing. It's obviously driven by what humans want.
It's a bridge between the past and the present. The past provides the justification, and the present keeps it alive.
It does. And when you read about lots of people going on pilgrimage in lots of historical periods and lots of different religions, refer to going in the footsteps of previous pilgrims, or I'm reaching back to my ancestors, or this is where people have always seen the gods. So that idea of continuity is incredibly important to pilgrimage places and the experience of pilgrimage.
So what hooked me on your book was not the title, but the subtitle, How Pilgrimage Changed the World. Because so many of the pilgrimage books I read are more in the vein of how pilgrimage changed me.
Yes.
How pilgrimage changed my life. And so this is an angle that isn't explored as much. And so I want to look at that from a few different angles, some of which you've already alluded to. Mm-hmm. And the first part of that is, let's talk about how pilgrimage influenced politics or affected governments in different places. How has that worked?
Well, various different ways. So you might have a pilgrimage site that's a particular ruler, whether we're talking a modern political entity like a government and a state, or whether you're talking about an ancient emperor or a king or a prince. Having physical possession of a pilgrimage site of importance gives you spiritual authority, because for one thing, you're saying, well, I rule over this. It's a sacred place. I wouldn't be allowed to do this if the gods or God did not approve in some way. So that gives you some kind of authority. Then there's the amount of money you can lavish on a place. So if we look at early Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, the early leaders of the Byzantine Empire, and here we're sort of talking 3rd, 4th century, the emperors, they create a rival to Rome. They create this new Rome, and they pack that city with relics, bodies of the saints, things like that. Until they do that, Constantinople isn't a particularly sacred place. They've got a couple of really obscure local saints, but otherwise there's nothing interesting. But what they do is they import all of this stuff and they make it this powerful treasure house of relics. And that gives them an awful lot of religious authority. Because if you have the head of John the Baptist, if you have all of these passion relics, if your mother, Helena, goes off and finds a bit of the true cross and brings it back, then look at all the power you have got concentrated in this place. So you've got places that people control and it gives them authority. You've got the ways it builds them up and it gives them authority. You've also got the way political rulers might go on pilgrimage as a sign of their political authority, because they're sort of saying, I can do this. Look at my huge procession. So we have Mansa Musa, who is the 13th century king of Mali. He goes on pilgrimage from Mali across North Africa to Mecca, and he takes a vast train of people with him. So it's a great way to show off to all the neighbours while going through this devotional exercise. Look what I've got. And apparently when they get to Cairo, he spends so much gold, or his entire entourage do, that they crash the value in the city. So it lets you show people, look at my power, and look, I can march through your dominions. I can do this. I can get to these places. And the final way that it's really politically useful for leaders in lots of different contexts is facilitating access for other people. So if you control an important pilgrimage site, let's say Jerusalem, at various times in its history, as it has fallen under the rule of Muslim authorities, Christian authorities, and then back to the Ottoman Turks, you let people in or you prohibit them from coming in, and that gives you authority and power. And it can obviously lead to disputes and rivalry, and it sparks off other things. It leads to, for example, one of the causes of the Crimean War in the 19th century is actually what's going on in Jerusalem. But even on a more sort of everyday scale, what you find is various rulers, particularly of large international, I suppose, empires, they will facilitate pilgrimage for the people who live on their lands as a way of saying, look, our rule gives you what you want. We are supporting your religion, therefore you should owe us some degree of loyalty. So the leaders of the Russian Empire, they facilitate pilgrimage on the Hajj down to Mecca for their Muslim subjects. And so does the British Empire. They facilitate pilgrimage from India on the Hajj, from across all their lands. And one of the things that the British government does, they're quite savvy, is they employ Thomas Cook, who are the huge travel agents who really get involved in pilgrimage early on, internationally as well as within Britain. And they organise these pilgrimages, and they do things like set up cholera stations to try and limit things like the spread of disease. So right from the top down, the leaders who make statements politically to the level at which they facilitate the pilgrimage of their subjects as a way to give themselves political, spiritual capital, it covers all of those different things.
I really enjoyed reading about how the Greek political leaders would go to Delphi to get endorsement for unpopular decisions.
Yes.
That if the oracle endorsed it, then they could go forward and justify it to the people.
Yes, I mean, that's far more explicit, because usually when you go on pilgrimage, you just pray, but you don't get an answer. And so that's the really interesting thing about Delphi, is that leaders of all the various different Greek city-states, they might visit some other oracles, but this was the creme de la creme of oracle consultation. Quite often they would have already made a decision, and they would go to Delphi to seek the advice of the oracle, who was a woman sitting on a tripod who would deliver frankly obscure and confusing messages. And then they would say, oh, well, that means we should go invade, or we should go and colonize. And so they used this as the underpinning to justify some of what they did. It didn't always go well, because quite often they misinterpreted what she said, or what she said was clear but could be read two different ways. And so some rulers did come a cropper when they listened to the oracle at Delphi. But yeah, that's a very interesting way of going on pilgrimage, is sort of rubber stamping decisions already made and ignoring them if you don't like the answer.
One other example that jumped out at me comes from Rome, from Italy, and the way that pilgrimage can be co-opted by a political leader like Mussolini in order to serve his own purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get various political regimes who either embrace pilgrimage or they try and stamp it out because they want loyalty to themselves. So in the case of Mussolini in Italy, he creates this cult around himself, essentially. And so while people are used to coming on Rome to visit all of the Catholic sites and to hopefully get a glimpse of the Pope, Mussolini takes the language of this pilgrimage and he turns it round so that people come on fascist pilgrimage. And he stages an exhibition celebrating his regime. And that has the whole language of pilgrimage sort of mapped into it. And at the very end of the rooms that you go round, it's almost like a shrine to his authority and his way of ruling Italy. So he's not Catholic. Well, he's not exactly a devout man himself, let's say, but he uses it because people know the language. Everyone understands the language of pilgrimage. If you look at the number of things that refer to pilgrimage, but it's just on journeys, places, or visits. So it's a really handy shorthand. And the other end of the spectrum of fascism, that is, if you look at Spain, you get the 20th century civil war in Spain, and you get Franco, and he is from Galicia. He is from northwestern Spain. St. James at Santiago de Compostela is his local saint. So he wants to revere him. He wants to promote pilgrimage to him as a way of saying, look, this is my guy. This also happens to be the saint who is the Spanish saint, and he's supporting what I do. So he and the Falangists, the people who follow him, get very interested in pilgrimage. Yes, for religious reasons, because many of them are Catholics, obviously. It's Catholic and majority country, but also because of a way of sort of making a statement about supporting his regime. So, it pops up in places where you don't expect it. By contrast, you look at communism in the 20th century, and they want to suppress religion because they want communism to be the religion. So you don't get pilgrimage used in the same way.
Related to politics, but worthy of its own separate discussion, is the way that pilgrimage shapes national identity, or more broadly, just galvanizes communities. This comes up a lot, especially in the second half of your book. Where do we see pilgrimage influencing national identity?
In terms of national identity, so on a large scale, you'd see somewhere like Amritsar in Punjab gives a particular identity to the Sikhs. So if you're a minority within a large country, obviously there's been people in India of various religions, it allows that group of people to come together around one particular pilgrimage site. So it gives them a place to focus their identity, where their spiritual leaders can, make statements, give speeches that lend some sort of authority to what they're doing. So you get that kind of national identity. Then you get the national identity of very, very important sites like Taishan in China, where the emperors go. We're talking pre-communism, of course, because this is a way for them to say, I have been accepted, as I've said before, but also, I have authority over all of China. I've now become such a powerful ruler, and I've done such a good job that I can go on pilgrimage up Taishan. Some emperors delay it. They don't do it until they're successful enough to feel that they're worthy of the pilgrimage. And Taishan is so important, as the other sacred mountains of China, that as a symbol, it's something that appeared on the 5 yuan note, which is, the most popular piece of paper currency in China. And if you've ever been in sort of gift shops in China or Chinese-themed ones elsewhere, and you've seen those incense burners that are in the shape of a mountain with incense, that's because you burn incense on Taishan. So you can have them in your home, you see. So very much a national sort of symbol. On the other hand, you've got sites that are about identities of peoples, let's say. So on a much smaller scale, but just as important. And in the book, I talk about a few that probably far less familiar to readers. That's Ratana Pa in New Zealand, Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer in southern France in the Camargue, and Bear Butte, which is a mountain in South Dakota. And each of these three sites is spiritually important to a minority group. So Bear Butte to Native Americans, Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer to gypsies of Europe, gypsies, travellers, and so forth, depending upon which terminology you use. It's a fraught space. And in Ratana Pa, the North Island of New Zealand, that's a Maori pilgrimage site. And in each of these cases, these sites are very important to the identity of those individual groups. And going on pilgrimage there allows them to come together. Gypsy travellers, of course, they're very disparate by their nature. If gypsies go on pilgrimage to Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer every summer, it's where they can come together, arrange marriages, business deals. They play music around the campfires, which leads to the Gypsy Kings. And if listeners don't know, stick it into YouTube and listen. And so it's the one time that they can come together. And then when you look at Bear Butte in South Dakota, Native Americans went there on pilgrimage because it's where they got answers from their creator about how they should live, how they should rule, what they should do. And in the 19th century, they came up across white settlers coming into the area who wanted to suppress native religion. For them, it was just a mountain. They wanted to mine in the area. It's just next to the Black Hills where they found gold. And so they wanted to stop Native American access. And actually arguments about that rumbled on all the way through the 20th century because Native Americans weren't allowed to visit. They weren't allowed to leave their reservations. There was a famous court case about it. And in particular, when the mountain was turned into a national state park, the Native Americans said, we go up there to do spiritual things and people are taking photographs of us. How would you feel if we went into church while you were praying and started snapping away? So, they say hands off our church because it's very important. And something similar again, Ratana Pa in New Zealand. It is founded on this farm as the result of a vision a Maori man has when his son is ill. And for just over a decade, he's a healer, and that's why people go. But then when he dies, it becomes a political focus. And it's all about Maori identity and Maori freedoms, because they are an oppressed underclass in New Zealand. And they start to use it as a focal point to gather politically and eventually get MPs into the New Zealand Parliament, which is why nowadays, if you're a politician in New Zealand or an aspiring politician, you go on pilgrimage to Ratana Pa in January every year as a way to court the Maori vote. If you like, the white Western descendants who are the dominant force in politics, they don't necessarily believe in what Ratana is all about, but that's where they have to go. So there are sort of different ways that minority groups, marginalized groups, and oppressed groups focus on and develop their pilgrimages to particular sites, because it gives them an identity and a way of coming together. And they're all quite unique.
Another example that stood out to me in your book was Muxima, Angola, and thinking about how this is a way that pilgrimage functions in a decolonizing context, where you have this site that was originally a pilgrimage shrine for the Portuguese as they colonized, and yet over time it seems to have flipped.
Yes, I found that really interesting. As you say, this is a church overlooking the bend in the river in Muxima. It's up just sort of raised up on the riverbank, and behind it you can see the fort that was built by the Portuguese. And this was very much a religious settlement to cater to them. And you get this all over the place, where people colonize and they build a fort or a castle. You have to cater to spiritual needs. And throughout the early years of the Portuguesization of Angola, they set about converting, often forcibly, the local population, some of whom quite happy to embrace, or at least notionally embrace, Catholicism as a way of getting on. But also that the river that it overlooks was one of the main ways to get enslaved people who were caught in the interior of Angola down to the coast, to the capital at Luanda, and then across, and a lot of them went to Brazil. And so one of the points about this church is it's one of those sites where enslaved people were probably forcibly converted. And so you're right, it's this really interesting thing that it's a site of colonization, and it's a site intimately associated with the slave trade that went past, floated past its doors. And yet it is being embraced by Angolans. It's the most important Catholic pilgrimage site in the country. And again, it's visited by political leaders. It's attacked by those who dislike Catholicism. But it's become really important to their identity and their community. It probably helps that Muxima translates as heart. The language of Muxima is also used in popular songs and novels, where they talk about the heart of Angola is also that pilgrimage site. So that works quite nicely for them. But they don't seem to have an issue with it. And I suppose that's true with other pilgrimage sites. You can understand it when it's further back, that they might be built by people conquering one country or another, or of missionaries even, going to places like India. But yes, this one is particularly interesting because it is so important to Angolans and has just been, you'll forgive the pun, taken to their heart as the place of pilgrimage.
Something that is sort of oppositional to the heart, at least in terms of how modern pilgrims on the Camino talk about it, is the relationship between business and pilgrimage. A common thread in forums is criticizing the commercialization of the Camino. So what is the historic relationship between business and pilgrimage? And was there ever a purer time for pilgrimage? Did that ever happen?
Not really. Pilgrimage has always been incredibly commercial. If you look at the Middle Ages, and religious centres would acquire relics, the body of a saint, have a vision, whatever, to make their holy site into something special, because it was so important for their growth and for their income and trade. So that wasn't a problem at all. And the idea that there's something wrong about the commercialization of religion is this contrast between the sacred and the profane. The idea that because something is spiritual, it has to have this purity, it has to have austerity, you have to do it properly, whatever that means, and that you shouldn't engage with the world necessarily. But unless you're genuinely planning on some kind of penitential pilgrimage where you're going to beg at the side of the road, you need somewhere to stay. You will need somewhere to eat out in the evenings, and you will probably want to buy things to take home. I mean, pilgrimage is seen as the forerunner for tourism, because it was all about transport, accommodation, souvenirs, access, being able to move people around. And that was as true of the ancient pilgrims, as the medieval, as the early modern, as they are today. So I think people need to, instead of sort of going, commercialization is dreadful, is to think, well, it's not commercialization. I couldn't do this journey if some of these things weren't there. I'm not obliged to buy the souvenirs, but some people buy them because, they're taking something spiritual home with them. So in the Middle Ages, for example, people buy these sort of pewter pilgrimage badges and things like that. And they believe that because they've been at the holy site, these badges will be imbued with some kind of spiritual radioactivity. Radioactivity is the phrase historian Robert Finucane uses. And they take them home. And then if somebody's sick, they might, press them onto the sick part of their body or something along those lines. So it's about transportable spirituality rather than commercialization and taking advantage. So if you go to Lourdes, the Disneyland of Catholicism, glow-in-the-dark rosaries, all kinds of fantastic shaped bottles for water, things like that. One person's hideous souvenir is another person's spiritual devotional object, and who's to say otherwise? So I think people need to calm down a bit about the idea that commercialization is a bad thing. If it's facilitating the pilgrimage and it's helping people take spirituality home, if that's what they want, then is it a bad thing? I tell you what, listeners who dislike the idea of commercialization, they should do the whole Camino without spending a single euro, then see how they go on. I think they'll be embracing the commercialization then.
It's interesting seeing the criticism of Roman Jubilees in the 14th century as just a crass money-making opportunity, or people complaining about luxury hotels in Jerusalem under British rule in the 19th century, or people taking the train to Lourdes. A lot of these conversations that we still see circulating today that have unfolded for centuries.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on the subject of, people taking the train, that's cheating in some way. Lourdes has never been a walking pilgrimage. It arose in the 19th century. Yes, local people would walk because they had no alternative, but they very quickly realized people wanted to come in great numbers. So, they tapped into the local railway network, and the French railway companies offered discounted tickets so that you could go. And if you look at 19th, 20th and 21st century images of pilgrims going to Lourdes, they are not walking. They are going to be pushed in wheelchairs. They are carried on stretchers. Many of them are seriously sick. There's no way that they could do it. And for them, a journey by train is a darn sight more agonizing than walking 50 miles for me. So if it's a question of doing it properly and arduously, they're having a much harder time of it than us. But the interesting thing about railway is that a lot of this idea that it's cheating actually sort of stems in the 19th century. So there's a story that does the rounds from a 17th century German novel. And it's a short part within it, and it's known as The Pilgrim and the Peas. And this is a story, it's a humorous story about a man going on pilgrimage to somewhere in Switzerland, and he put peas in his shoes. And his friend, who's a bit of a wastrel, he says he will go with him, and he will put peas in his shoes too, but he boils them the night before. So his peas are soft, okay? So this is The Pilgrim and the Peas. And it's taken out of this novel, and the story is then used in lots of humorous contexts to talk about corruption of the church or people who cheat because it makes life easier. But people seem to think that this is a genuine medieval tale, that this is what pilgrims used to do. Stick it into the internet, dig around a bit, and you will find people say, oh yeah, medieval pilgrims put peas in their shoes. No, they didn't. This is a story from a novel. By the time we get to the 19th century, it starts to become more popular. This is primarily sort of in newspapers, 19th century Britain. But people don't associate it with cheating until the rise of Catholic pilgrimage by rail in the second half of the century, and particularly the 1870s, because the British press don't like Catholicism. A lot of it is anti-Catholic. So they are criticising people who are going to Lourdes, to Pilgrim, Paris-le-Monial, because they're going by train. They're like, oh, they're not even doing it properly. They just buy a cook's ticket and off they go. It's not really about pilgrimage. It's about the fact they're Catholics. And they refer to this medieval story of the Pilgrim and the Peas, which wasn't a medieval story at all. So this whole idea of not doing it properly if you don't walk is a weird 19th century invention, essentially. Start of the 19th century, people don't really talk about it. Pilgrimage booms in the middle of the 19th century, and people start to complain about the railway for that reason. It's not really about how they're doing it. And people hark back to the Middle Ages. Yeah, but people walked then. How else are they going to do it? Unless you're wealthy enough for a horse, you're going to walk. And if you read medieval pilgrimage accounts, and you get lots of them in miracles, people don't really talk about their journey. They talk about why they're going, and they talk about getting there. But they don't go, oh, and I walked and the following things happened. The exception is where people are doing a pilgrimage of penance. But otherwise, it's just how you get from A to B then. Yes, so I have this conversation on loop quite a lot with my husband, who's also a historian, but who also walked the Camino. And so the idea that people are cheating or they only went from Sarria, I'm very familiar with. But as I always say to him, the 12th century guide to doing the Camino tells you how to do it in 12 days, which means you have to do some of it by horse. It's not about walking.
The last topic I want to ask you about related to that larger theme of how pilgrimage changed the world is pilgrimage as a reconciliatory force, which is something I'm personally interested in. And it was, to me, one of the most interesting stories in the book, sticking with Lourdes a little bit longer, about how pilgrimage can function in this way. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is the next thing that I'm working on. Throughout history, pilgrimage has been used to give thanks for a successful war, to gain healing in that respect. But in the 20th century, particularly after the First World War, pilgrimage really took off as a way to bring people together in mass prayer, bring people together from opposing sides, German and Allied forces, in a common sort of bond of pilgrimage and prayer. And after the Second World War, there was a great emphasis on doing this at Lourdes. Some of it had happened after the First World War, but really the emphasis was after the Second World War. And you've got groups of veterans, you get groups of German veterans who are brought specifically to get them to come on a joint pilgrimage of reconciliation. And you get them turning up on pilgrimage, and often they're still in their uniforms. Sometimes they're in their clothing from their time as prisoners of war. And it's all about them praying together and being reconciled. And this developed throughout the second half of the 1940s and 50s, until by 1958, they founded the International Military Pilgrimage to Lourdes, which still runs every year now. And yes, Lourdes is a Catholic site, but essentially it's an ecumenical pilgrimage. Anyone can go. And it involves pilgrims from all around the world and all kinds of different military forces. And so they come together in a spirit, I suppose, of brother and sisterhood, to pray, to talk to each other about their experiences, because obviously it also allows them to come together and talk in those respects. So there's a real emphasis on doing that there. And you do get it in other sites as well. Bosnian pilgrimage to Jasna Gora in the wake of the Bosnian conflict. You get it in post-Soviet places as well. So increasingly, it's seen as a way that is non-political to bring people together. And one of the most interesting examples, I think, for Lourdes, and I'm trying to find more out about it, so if anybody listening knows, do let me know, is in September 1946, there is a prisoner of war pilgrimage to Lourdes. And let me just read you this from the Southern Cross newspaper, which is a Catholic newspaper from Australia. And it says, the Nazi terror camps of Belsen, Buchenwald and Dachau have been built again, this time in the smiling French countryside around Lourdes. This month, more than 65,000 former French prisoners and deportees are living again in these prisons where they suffered untold miseries. The whole of the countryside around Lourdes has been transformed by strange new buildings, and copies of all the concentration camps, prison camps, and SS camps have been built in their appropriate geographical positions. The roads are lined with barbed wire. So,
wow,
it's so surreal. There are large sort of flat green areas around Lourdes, and they put up these signs for the different camps. So if you were in Dachau, you would be able to find it and go and find people you were in prison with. They lined the access to Lourdes with barbed wire. Surreal, isn't it?
wow.
And there are a few newspaper reports of these, and there's a couple of short videos about it. But this idea that bringing them together, because they promised, if we survive this, we will meet again at Lourdes, we'll go in thanks. But that they theme it so strongly around, their captivity. They're still in the striped uniforms of the concentration. To some percentage. It's entirely surreal. Yeah, and some of that carries on. But I thought that was a fascinating way that they use pilgrimage for sort of post-war acceptance and bringing people together in this really, strange way. I mean, obviously you get people who go and visit prisoner of war camps, internment camps, Japan, all over Germany, Eastern Europe, and they go on pilgrimage to these places. But this is a particular one where you gather them all together and you send them to Lourdes in this way. I don't think it was ever repeated. And like I said, I can only find a little bit of information. So I'm still digging.
Yeah.
But yeah, I found that one fascinating.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Wow. A little disturbed and also, fascinated. Let's zoom out. You've studied these 19 pilgrimages, obviously you've studied plenty of other pilgrimages, so you have a ton of experience to draw upon. So I'm interested in your ideas about what makes pilgrimage thrive or decline. Within the book, you spotlight some that are currently thriving, some that are little more than historic curiosities today, and then others that have had kind of peaks and valleys over the years that have declined markedly and then made a comeback, kind of like the Camino. So,
Yeah.
what, in your view, influences a pilgrimage's success or failure?
Well, that's one of those multi-point answer questions. Well, first of all, you've got to have, it's got to be relevant. It sounds really sort of modern and, oh, it's all relevant to current experience. But quite often you find a pilgrimage site will be revived or grow in popularity in response to something that's happening at a particular time. For example, if we look at Iona, tiny island off the west coast of Scotland, which is a pilgrimage site in the Middle Ages. And then with the Reformation in the 16th century, it isn't anymore. It's just a small, poor island. And then towards the end of the 19th century, it's revived as a pilgrimage site. Why? Why there? Why then? Well, you've got this rise of Catholic pilgrimage, as I've already said. You've got the fact that Catholicism isn't really that popular in Scotland compared to, nonconformist, Presbyterian, whatever, that kind of religion. And so they don't like the idea the Catholics are getting into Iona, so they go as well. And at one point, there's a pilgrimage where they're both conducting services and they can hear each other. It's like a sing-off, a mass-off, which is quite funny. So you've got that. And then the Duke of Argyll, who owns the island, he's very interested in its history and so researches it. So you've got antiquarianism, you've got Catholic resurgence, and you've got Presbyterian and Protestant fight back, I suppose, all in one. And it coincides with the rise of the railways and the improvement of transport across Scotland more generally. So that helps. Oh, and the rise of leisure time, of course, in the 19th century.
Sure.
People suddenly have a tiny amount of time off. So it rises for that reason. And it's popular, it takes off. But really, it takes off in the interwar period because a man who gets involved up there, who was a priest on mainland Scotland, he sees pilgrimage as a way of dealing with post-war experiences, and he sets up a community there, and that develops. And that is now a sort of a global community. It's an ecumenical Iona community that draws people in from all around the world. So it becomes popular again in the 19th century for sort of half a dozen reasons together, but stays popular because it evolves and expands to the number of people it will attract, which is amazing because it's a tiny place. There's hardly anywhere to stay. And you have to sit on the coach for ages to get there. But yeah, it still appeals. So you've got places like that rise and fall. Others, of course, an entire religion falls from favour. The Reformation, the end of Christianity in ancient Greece. So that leads to decline. And in other cases, it's because it's politically useful for the people who possess a site to rejuvenate it. So if we go to one of the most important places, Rome, you would assume Rome has been a major pilgrimage centre forever, uninterrupted, since time immemorial. But there are actually large chunks of the Middle Ages where Rome is quite a squalid city, where pilgrims aren't really going in great numbers. You've obviously got the Roman ruins, and you've got the catacombs with the relics of saints outside the city. People aren't really coming in. And then they hit on the idea of these Jubilee years in 1300, and that starts to get things rolling. And they realise, the popes particularly, that this gets people in, this gets people to the city, look at all the money they're bringing in. And so, it rises because the papacy is rising in power. And then when you get to the 16th century, you've got Reformation across Europe, the Counter-Reformation, Council of Trent, the Catholics want to say, no, what we're doing is legitimate, thank you very much. And so they rejuvenate it again, and they make it even more fancy. So they're responding to some wider pressures. And that's why you get these sort of pits and troughs and these rises and falls, because it has to respond to what people want. Pilgrimage and its creation of pilgrimage places and the whole practice of it isn't passive. It evolves, and it does so in relation to everything around it, from economics to politics to weather. I mean, climate change is a whole other thing now for pilgrimage. So even if you're not religious and you never go on pilgrimage, it's tapped into the world in so many different ways.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and I started thinking about this when I spoke with Victoria Preston about her book, We Are Pilgrims, is the tension or the variety between pilgrimages that are quite exclusive and focused on one particular religion or faith tradition, and those that are much more inclusive and that accommodate a lot of different faiths. And so I think an interesting contrast is the Hajj, which is
Mm.
exclusive to Muslims. But then you also wrote about how Istanbul quite explicitly set out to be a bridge, a place that could accommodate Muslims and non-Muslims alike coming in. So I'm curious about how that works with pilgrimage, that push towards exclusivity or inclusivity, and why that might change from place to place.
Well, I suppose in the context of going to Mecca for the Hajj, is that kind of is going to be exclusive because it's one of the 5 tenets of Islam is to go to Mecca. So there isn't an instruction on anyone else to go there. There are plenty of other pilgrimage sites you can go if you're Muslim, and obviously you get the split between Sunni and Shiite as well. They have slightly different emphases. So there's a reason really that getting to Mecca is just of interest to Muslims. I mean, I say in the book it's confined to Muslims. Somebody came to a talk I did the other week who lives in Jeddah and says, no, it's opened up now, but I can't find anything to tell me that would be so. It's just a Muslim pilgrimage site, but also it's even more controlled than that because the leaders of Saudi Arabia have introduced in the last, is it about 20 years, a visa system because so many people wanted to go. So even more limited, and they're obviously not going to give those to people who are not there for the right reasons. So that's exclusive because the tenets of the religion say that it's for these people, they should come, they don't talk about anyone else. But in other places, like Istanbul, you have got so many different things, like I said, these different things imported. And then you've got it as a city that changes hands. So if we look at Mecca, it has stayed in Islamic hands. If we look at Constantinople / Istanbul, it was taken over by Christian forces, the early emperors. And then in 1453, it was conquered by Islamic forces in the Ottoman Empire. And in order to make it a spiritual landscape that suited them, they had to discover suitable relics. And so they discovered, the burial place of Prophet Muhammad's banner carrier. So they introduced all these other things. But, the other stuff was still there, all the Christian things, the Orthodox Christian things. And so as a melting pot where West meets East, it made sense to make it accessible to all these different groups passing through because it underpins a lot of the economy. If you've got people sailing through the Bosphorus, want to go down to Mecca, if they want to go to Jerusalem, if they want to go anywhere really, it makes sense to embrace both sides. And then, of course, for a while, Istanbul was secularized, which put everything, if you like, on a level playing field. And now it's swung back towards Islam. Things are changing again.
Just a couple questions left. One
Yeah.
that I'm just curious about from a research perspective. You had 19 case studies, and I imagine that pacing yourself was one of the challenges because you could write a whole book about any of these, but you're writing a book that brings in all 19. You can't spend unlimited time on all of them. But no matter how disciplined you are, like I know this from personal experience, sometimes you just get sucked in. And there's one where you can't pull yourself away. You just keep reading. Is there one that became that sort of rabbit hole for you that you really just kept wanting to go back to and read more about?
Yeah, and strangely enough, it's the least religious one in the book. It's Buenos Aires.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not as interested in secular pilgrimage. The main focus of my research is probably Catholic pilgrimage because originally medievalist, that's where I started out. But I suppose like many people, I'd seen the film Evita. I had Don't Cry For Me, Argentina stuck in my head on a loop during that chapter. But the more I dug, the more bizarre it got. So I was aware that, she was revered almost like a saint and efforts had been made to canonize her that were poo-pooed by the papacy. But the fact that Eva Perón, the wife of the president, Juan Perón, was not only treated like a saint in all imagery and propaganda, but there were so many things that, in 200 years' time, people look back and probably go, why wasn't she a saint? Because once you distance yourself from the actual experience and the politics, things are very different. She died at 33, Christ-like. She helped the poor and apparently affected healing and would touch the sick. Very, very Christ-like. When she died, her husband had her body embalmed. We know the science, but incorruptible body. There's a whole thing there where her body is hidden and in an attic and found and then buried in a secret grave in Italy and then brought back. It's crazy. So there was so much I found that the imagery all around Eva Perón, the shrine set up in restaurants and cafes across Buenos Aires in particular, even graffiti on shop shutters that are pulled down, depicting her with a halo and things like that. And, we're talking 70 odd plus years after her death. To all intents and purposes, she is a popular saint, just never canonized. And it'd be really interesting to see how, like I say, 100 years from now, if you are listening, archive historians listening to old podcasts, whatever happened to the cult of Eva Peron? So that's the one that really gripped my attention.
That's awesome. Okay, last question. Got to ask you something very specific to the Camino.
Okay.
It's the last pilgrimage spotlighted in your book.
Yep.
Even people who have read lots and lots about the Camino, I think they'll still find some really interesting details in there. One of the ones that jumped out at me is that in the resurgence in the 20th century, there was established a 300-kilometer minimum walking distance for pilgrims. Today, it's much discussed the 100-kilometer requirement, and many think that it should go away. But we're living in this boom time in the Camino's popularity. Yes. And so, kind of hearkening back a little bit to the earlier question, having studied so many pilgrimages, which factors do you think have contributed to its resurgence? Why do you think the Camino has had this resurgence today? And what would you speculate will eventually contribute to its inevitable decline?
Okay. You start with some big questions there. Okay, so what led to its rise? Well, yeah, because it went through quite a period where it wasn't. I mean, in the Middle Ages, going to Santiago, massively important. It's one of the big three, Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago. Then it goes through this period in the early modern sort of 16th, 17th, 18th century where it isn't so popular. People still go, but it's not nearly as popular. And then in the late 19th century, they rediscover the relics. And lo and behold, you can revive a cult. It's amazing what you can do when you find some bones. I know, very cynical. And then across the course of the 20th century, yes, as we've already discussed, it's popular under Franco because he uses it. But what really, really makes it popular isn't religion as such. It is taking a religious site and using it to unify Europe, and it's political. It's about the development of the EU. So they make the Camino the first cultural walking route because it already exists, it's already neatly mapped out. And whereas, and I suppose geography has a lot to do with this, whereas other places, you might have lots of roads going to it, like Rome, the beauty of Santiago de Compostela is it's on the end of a peninsula. So once you've got people over the French border, you're channeling them. So it's much easier to create a route, quite frankly. So there's that. Obviously, there are all the other routes. There's the one coming up through Portugal, the Primitivo. But essentially, you can get people along. And you have the historical underpinnings because there's a guide telling you how to do it. So really, that's what helps it kick off. And you get a rise of people being interested in walking for health. You get interest of individuals like the priest El Cabrero, who pilgrims have to thank for the yellow colour scheme because he was given paint, and that's the arrows with. It's the only reason it's yellow. And the blue background is because they're the colours of the EU.
I saw that in your book. I've never seen that anywhere else. That's not coincidence. That's intentional.
Yeah, intentional. Political branding.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And then when they said, pilgrims have to travel a particular distance, they need to do this, they need to do that, is, the Catholic Church looked back to the Middle Ages and they said, well, people did get these Compostela certificates for going. We're going to do something like that. But because so many people started to want to go, and really this is only the end decades of the century, they're basically starting to control it. So in the same way that Muslims going on the Hajj to Mecca, they have to get a visa, how are you going to control people turning up and wanting to say they've been to Santiago? You put distance limits on it. You make them do something. They've got to walk. They've got to go by bike. They've got to do it on a horse. And so people have thought that these are rules that must be stuck to, and they are ancient and they are immutable, but they're not. They're late 20th century impositions to control and create this sort of unifying pilgrimage route. So yes, historically, pilgrims are the definition of going to Santiago, but it's exceptionally clever marketing, which gets us back to the commercialization of pilgrimage. You're even going on the Camino, you've already bought into this idea without knowing it. Yes, so what might lead it eventually to decline? Well, I don't know, rivals. There are so many, as you said, Camino is so popular that everywhere around the world is badged as a Camino. Shikoku, which I also cover in Japan, the Japanese Camino. Any walking route around Britain that opens, they go, it's the Saint whatever Camino. I'm like, okay, calm down. Get very carried away. It's because it's instant brand recognition. You call it a Camino, people know what they're getting. So rivals, perhaps. It could be, as I mentioned earlier, climate change. As Spain gets hotter and hotter, it's 46 degrees in southern Spain today. The north is cooler, but will people not go so much in the summer? Because it is an endurance walk. It's not like you you fly there like Mecca, and there are cooling fans, and yes, it's incredibly hot, and that is a problem of its own. But for a shorter period of time and controllable, will people want to walk there in the heat? Or will suddenly St. Olav's Way in Norway be the place to go because it's not nearly so hot? Maybe if the Norwegians come up with some really good branding,
Yeah.
they will make it work. Which I know sounds cynical, but religion has always been branded. It's always been sold as one thing or another. So it's simply the way it evolves. So we'll see. Will it continue to grow? Will it go into decline? Let's see what the next 10 years give us, I suppose.
Awesome. Kathryn, this has been great. I really enjoyed reading through your book and this conversation. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
The biggest problem with reading a book that spotlights 19 different pilgrimage sites, it just makes the to be walked or visited list almost impossibly long already, even longer. But out of all of that, the part of the discussion I still can't get over is Kathryn's commentary on Lourdes and the 1946 pilgrimage of former POWs and concentration camp survivors. After the conversation, she passed along an archival newsreel clip of the event. I'll include a link of that in the episode description. But here's the audio. Check it out.
To the world-famous shrine at Lourdes in France, the homeless come on a post-war pilgrimage. Former prisoners, displaced persons, most of them from the frightful Nazi concentration camps. General Giraud, German prisoner in 2 wars, leads fellow fighting men to the grotto, where faith heals broken bodies and wounded spirits. Some 100,000 hear the Holy Father's message at a great open-air Mass. You represent your Catholic companions in exile and captivity. After the terrible tempest, you are in a harbor of safety. Historic Lourdes has seldom witnessed a more moving spectacle. Here in this manifestation of sublime faith is inspiration for a troubled world.
Okay, setting aside the cringe-inducing nature of some of the staging and organizational choices, like lining the paths with barbed wire and dressing the survivors in their prison gear. Good Lord. Yikes. This is still a remarkable story. And I can't wait to see what more Kathryn can dig up. And it leaves me once again circling back to this question. Is there anything pilgrimage can't do? That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Dr. Kathryn Hurlock. You can find her book, Holy Places, How Pilgrimage Changed the World, at online bookstores, especially in the UK, and a good sample available at profilebooks.com. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at caminopodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/Dave Whitson. Back again next week.